Hey everybody, Pastor Matt here. Thank you so much for checking into our podcast at Gospel Fellowship PCA. Hey, what if I told you that there is a solid, biblical, doctrinally faithful Reformed church on a beautiful campus just a stone's throw north of Pittsburgh? Would you be interested? Well, let me tell you a little bit about it. We don't have lasers, we don't have a fog machine, we don't have an American Idol stage, but we do have the sweetest, kindest people in the whole world. We sing psalms and hymns, and we preach the Bible chapter by chapter. We love Jesus, and we're on a mission to share the good news of the gospel with the world. So would you be interested in coming to a church like that? If so, come check us out, Gospel Fellowship PCA in Valencia, Pennsylvania, and feel free to visit our website, gospelfellowshippca.org, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Gospel Fellowship Presbyterian Church. And now for today's message.
Would you please stand for the reading and hearing of God's holy word? You can find this on page 749 if you're using the Pew Bibles. This is Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 36 to the end of the chapter. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand: Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. May God add his blessing on this, the reading of his holy and inspired word. Please be seated. Some of you may be familiar with the old German fairy tale, one collected by the brothers Grimm, The Fisherman and His Wife. The story begins with a couple, fairly poor enough that they live in a pot by the sea. To make a long story short, the fisherman comes across a fish that is able to grant wishes, and of course he doesn't feel like he needs anything. But his wife encourages him to return to the fish and, of course, to ask for a cottage. So he asks for a cottage. He goes back home. They have a cottage. And shortly, a couple weeks later, the wife encourages him to go back and to ask for a castle. So he returns to the fish. He asks for a castle. Sure enough, it's not too long until the wife desires to be king. He returns to the fish. He asks that she be made king. Sure enough, she's made king, and eventually she wants to be made emperor. So he returns to the fish, asks that she be made emperor. It's not too long until she wants to be made pope. So the fish makes her pope, and wouldn't you know it, she's up all night, unable to get any sleep, discontented, trying to figure out what it is that she would want next. And wouldn't you know, the sun begins to rise, and she realizes that she doesn't have power to raise the sun and the moon. And it drives her nuts that she might have to watch these things rise, not being able to control them. So she sends her husband back to the fish and asks to be made God. And the man and his wife are reduced back to the same poverty that they were in before, back to the pot. Now, I tell that story not to press it home too much, but simply to suggest that you see a very similar kind of narrative arc in this passage. The king of the north is filled with ambition and is rather successful in his gains. But there's limits as to what it is that he's able to do in terms of his pagan and worldly expansion. So eventually he turns his sights against the Holy Covenant. And he does dreadful things to the people of God and their land. But there's limits as to what it is that he's able to do. So then eventually we see the king described as one who would be God himself, exalting himself to the highest place. And it's not long until the time of the end comes, and even he is brought to nothing with none to help him. The same pattern, you see it. God prevails. There's none who can possibly dethrone him. I want us to look at this passage. It's a difficult one. Similar to last week, there's very hard things. We're not going to be able to answer all of the questions that we all might have. I've not had all of my questions answered, and there's some difficulty perhaps in even communicating whatever understanding I may have. But we're going to look at this in three main sections, and we'll begin with verses 20 through 28, considering the ambition of this king. Here's the first thing that I want you to consider. Cunning and craft in the service of this king's ambition works. Cunning and craft in the service of this king's ambition works, but it has its limits. In central focus here, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, as we've described before, portions of the empire of Alexander the Great that were divided. The north, you can consider it the kingdom of the Seleucids, or Syria. The south, the kingdom of the dynasty of the Ptolemies, or Egypt. And the king of the north that is primarily in view in this text, his name is Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. This is a man you may recall we learned about in Daniel chapter 8 when Pastor Matt preached on that section. For those interested, the king of the south, who's primarily in view, is Ptolemy Philometor, Ptolemy VI. But Antiochus, our main antagonist, I suppose, reigned from 175 to 164. But the main thing I want you to see about Antiochus is how impressive his exploits were by way of cunning and deceit and craftiness. Even the way he assumes the throne. Listen to how verse 21 describes it. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, you need to know, was not the natural heir to the throne. His father was Antiochus the Great. His son, Seleucus IV, was the king. And after he died, it was expected that Demetrius Soter would take his place. But instead of him, his uncle, Antiochus Epiphanes, assumed the throne. And while some people died, there was not all that much of a stir about it. This was a man who was cunning and able to manipulate things according to the way that he wanted. One commentator describes him as a master of intrigue. The same kind of thing progresses through these verses. There's reference to the prince of the covenant, probably better, a covenanted prince, someone with whom he had some kind of agreement. There's references to various alliances. This is a man who knew how to make a deal so that he could break it at the right time. He knew how to make use of the access and friendship that he had in order to slip his way in. This is not the kind of guy who would bang on your door demanding entry. This is the kind of guy who would already be in your living room before he would take action. You expect that he's going to be there. There's a phrase that's repeated a couple times in these verses, without warning. It's literally ease and quietness. In ease and quietness, he does something. They expect that things are peaceful and okay, and suddenly then he acts and makes use and leverages the situation. This is a man who is lavish, but always plotting and scheming. In fact, even later, you have this interesting portion that's described where it says the two kings sit together at a single table. Verse 27, as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. This seems to be a time when Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy VI, they were attempting, perhaps both lying to one another, but imagining and pretending that they were able to be helping one another towards the same enterprise. But of course, there's limits in what they were able to do. This is a man that demonstrates perhaps run-of-the-mill worldly ambition and power grabbing. And for some people, it comes back to get them. For others, however, they hit it big and they're a smashing success. But even then, it has its limits. Notice the limits that he runs up against. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. He comes up against the limit of God's decree. And beyond that, he can go no further. Sovereign, your ambition, the ambition of any king in this world, is not what rules and reigns and is sovereign, but always comes up against the sovereignty of God's decree. Worldly ambition may be successful, but it has its limits. Now, this is where things begin to get interesting as we transition to the next main section of this text. Look at verse 28. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Now, this seems to be a reference to a time when Antiochus, after being engaged in various military enterprises in Egypt, returns through the land of Palestine on the way back to Syria. And he engages in what would seem to be more of the same. He sees various actions and interprets them as a kind of rebellion against him. So we find in a book called First Maccabees, not something we receive as canonical, but still an ancient document. First Maccabees chapter 1 says this, that after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned, and he went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He took also the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, etc. He comes through and he pillages the temple and its precincts. He murders many people, doing his will in the land. And it would seem to be much of the same of what you've already found from Antiochus, but the text actually interprets things slightly differently. It says that he is set against the holy covenant. This is a kind of agreement that he's not able to wield to his own designs. And it recognizes that he's not simply gaining more wealth, but he is set against the holy covenant of God. And we'll see the significance of that in the next section. But the other thing I want you to notice is this, that what we find in this text is that the Lord extends his gaze into the heart of Antiochus. It says, his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Even a man like Antiochus IV, before he even comes onto the world stage, the Lord sees into his heart. It's astounding, the kind of gaze that our God has. So let's look at this next main section, verses 29 to 35. And what I want you to notice is this, that in the midst of this king's aggressive hostility against the Holy Covenant, God is faithful to fulfill all of his appointed and covenanted purposes. Let me say that again. In the midst of this king's aggressive hostility against the Holy Covenant, God is faithful to fulfill all of his appointed and covenanted purposes. In 168 BC, Antiochus returns again to Egypt. And he secures what would seem to be a rather decisive victory over the Ptolemaic kingdom. However, the Ptolemies receive a little bit of help from the outside. The reference in our passage in verse 30, for ships of Kittim shall come against him. This seems to be a reference to Roman ships that came from the island of Cyprus, known as Kittim in the scriptures at times. Ships of Kittim came to the aid of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and Popilius Linus, the Roman ambassador, led the defeat against Antiochus. So Antiochus, after securing much of the land of Egypt, at least as he desired, especially around Alexandria, then found himself defeated by the Romans, and Popilius, the Roman ambassador, demands from Antiochus that he relinquish his claim upon the land. Antiochus, of course, used to being able to weasel his way out of all sorts of things, demands for time to consult with his counselors. And Popilius Linus, in a classic story, takes his walking stick, draws a circle around Antiochus IV, and demands from him that before he leaves that circle, he must have his answer. Antiochus IV was humiliated and defeated. Now, before we move on to the rest of this portion, I want you to think about the significance of what's going on there from what we've already seen in the book of Daniel. This is the kingdom of Greece as represented by Antiochus IV at this point. The kingdom of Greece coming face to face with the Romans. The third kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar's dream coming face to face with the fourth and finding their limits. Antiochus IV, knowing that his time is short, then descends with rage upon the Holy Covenant. Look at what the text says. He shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. Antiochus is humiliated, defeated, and he turns himself against the people of God. Now, what you need to know what's going on in Palestine at this point, Antiochus had already inherited a kind of policy of what's called Hellenization or Greekification of much of the empire or the kingdom. So some of the Jews at this point were beginning to concede not only various aspects of their culture, but even significant aspects of their own religion. They were leaving these things aside, and there began to be Antiochus, as he came in, or at least by his representatives, came into Palestine. There began to be a much more insistent, a greater insistence on the Jews leaving behind things that God himself had commanded in terms of dietary restrictions, even the use of the covenant sign of circumcision and other offerings and such things. And you can read about it in the latter part of 1 Maccabees chapter 1 as it describes the Jews being forced to leave behind what are the things that God had commanded of them. And there's a profaning of the sanctuary, a horrific killing of God's people, and the burning of the city, and the temple itself is dedicated to Zeus. And in place of the burnt offering, or in its place over top of it, was built an altar to Zeus, what's described here as an abomination that makes desolate. These are the kinds of things that Antiochus engages in, at least through his emissary, in the land of Palestine against the people of God. And what's astounding is this, that in the midst of it all, verse 32, the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Now, it's a rather stirring phrase in English, which translated take action is a bit more of an ordinary word in Hebrew. It's simply to do. But the basic idea is that they're standing firm and they're doing as the Lord calls them to do. They're not thrown off balance. They're not tilted off in some way, but persevering in what the Lord calls them to do. God is going to fulfill his purposes in the midst of all kind of hostility and persecution. I want you to notice what it is that happens. Verse 33, the wise among the people shall make many understand. Even in the midst of persecution and such hostility and rage, what's happening? Wisdom is being disseminated unto more. There is, you can think of it this way, the word is at work amongst the people of God. It's astounding. Some people had been quick to join what were pagan nations and quick to leave the covenant, and Antiochus would take advantage of that. But others, who perhaps had not been drawn to such faithfulness by the working of the Spirit, are here being drawn by that as God is at work. God is growing the invisible church, you can think of it here. With those who are wise make many to understand. The second thing, though, is this, that still some stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. You know what it's like when the people of God are harmed and hurt and there's persecution. Some people fall away. But what does the Lord do? When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. When you get down to it, you know what the people of God need? Just a little help. That's it. If the Lord would simply sustain with any of his strength and power, it's enough for his people to endure. That's it. Just a little help. Just a notice from our God. And the people of God will endure. Now, some people see here a reference to a man named Judas Maccabeus, and whether or not that's the case, I want to read something that's recorded that he had said from 1 Maccabees. Whether or not it's original, it's still a stirring thing that I want to read for you. At a time when he was leading some people in defense of their land, very few people coming against a much larger army, and people were wondering whether or not they'd be able to be successful, and he responds this way: "It is easy for many to be hemmed in by a few. For in the sight of heaven, there is no difference between saving by many or by few. It is not on the size of the army that victory in battle depends, but strength comes from heaven." Now, whatever you make of all the situations surrounding that, the sentiment expresses all we need is a little help from our God to fortify our faith. Where does strength come? Where does victory come? Where does spiritual victory come? It comes from the Lord. If there's a little help, the people of God prevail. So what does God do? In the midst of this, with all the hostility against the covenant, I want you to see God is fulfilling his covenant purposes. This is a covenant that you cannot shake. In fact, if you try to shake it, what comes out of it is the life of the covenant. Look at your text. Verse 35. And some of the wise shall stumble. It seems terrifying, doesn't it? So that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. As terrible as some of these things were, what is God doing in the midst of it? He is purifying and sanctifying his people. Isn't this what we long for? Do we desire that the Lord would finish his work in our own hearts and lives? Terrible things are happening. But no matter how terrible, God is going and always will fulfill his covenant purposes. He did it then, and he does it now. The last main section, beginning in verse 36, is a difficult one. And commentators begin to be a little bit more divided as to how to understand this. And the two main questions are, is this describing, from verse 36 to the end of the chapter, is it still describing Antiochus IV? Or is it perhaps describing a much more ominous figure that later on in the Scriptures is sometimes known as the Antichrist, or the son of perdition, or the man of lawlessness? And commentators are a little bit divided, or at least have various differences as to how exactly to understand this. Here's some of the difficulties that we run into. In verses 40 and following, there seems to be a very similar kind of historical flow to what's going on. A sequence of military engagements and victories. The difficulty is that the history does not seem to very clearly correspond to what we know of the life and even death of Antiochus IV. It's described that he died in Palestine, it seems, but we know that he died in Persia. Even the reference to Moab here is Moab at the time of Antiochus IV did not exist in its kind of national identity. So there's some difficulty in trying to correlate what goes on in these verses to what's known of the life of Antiochus. However, when you come to verse 36, there doesn't seem to be a very clear shift away from one figure to another. It seems to be a continuous kind of flow as though we're dealing with some of the same persons, and some of the ways that's described in verse 36 and following might be attributed to Antiochus in some ways. And some scholars will point this out as a way of trying to say that perhaps this is a clue, scholars that I would not agree with, mind you, that perhaps this gives us a sense as to when the supposed writer of Daniel was writing, and that everything else that's taken place earlier in chapter 11 are things that are actually past history for the writer. And from 36 onward, this is the writer's attempt to actually predict what might happen in the future, and he gets it wrong a little bit. This is an unbelieving approach to the text of Scripture. But what I want you to notice is this, that the text that's given to us here, thoroughly faithful as it is, are words that are given to Daniel not for the purpose of answering disparaging comments of unbelievers, but is given for the purpose of fortifying the faith of God's suffering people. It's given for the purpose of fortifying the faith of God's suffering people. And I want you to see how that's the case. First of all, beginning in verse 36, we have what seems to be a description of the heart of what is behind the actions of Antiochus IV. When the people of God are suffering in all kinds of atrocious ways, you can imagine very easily that they would begin to wonder, does God see? Does God know? And does he care what his people are suffering? And these verses make it clear that the Lord sees beyond what is the perceived experience of the people of God, and he sees right to the heart of the matter. and that the assault against his people and the assault against his covenant, God sees as a direct challenge against him. Listen to this. The king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing words against the God of gods. God sees what is happening as an affront to his glory and his right and his prerogative. What we have here is not the triumph, by the way, of one religion over another. It makes it clear even in the text. Verse 37 and following, we won't go through the details, but there seems to be a kind of leaving behind of any kind of religious heritage. This is not somehow the assertion of one religion over another as though God were too weak to handle what is coming. But here is one who is filled with only destruction in mind and given a measure of worldly excess, it seems, but only because what is decreed shall be done, we hear in verse 36. But God sees straight to the heart of the matter as to what is going on. The Lord sees, the Lord knows, and he understands and interprets this as an assault and as an affront against his glory. And so we know that the Lord will always answer for his glory. The same principle outlasts Antiochus IV and is actually described elsewhere in the Scriptures. 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4 describes this very similar kind of idea again. Paul, writing to the church, he says this, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." The same kind of principle of evil at work in the days of Antiochus IV. This is the same kind of thing that endures beyond him and that the Lord in his time will deal with. The Lord sees straight to the heart of the matter and understands the significance of what Antiochus IV is doing. So when we get to verses 40 and following, what we have here is the Lord lifting the gaze of his people to the time of the end, when it is that he will ultimately and finally take this hostile enmity against the Lord and against his people, and take this evil and bring it low and have it reach its final demise. But here's what I want you to notice, that the Lord, I'm convinced, is speaking of what will ultimately take place on the last day in a way in which he is drawing from the historical idiom of the period of time that the people of God are suffering through in Antiochus IV. So he's using the language of the period of that history to describe what will take place on the last day as he defeats evil. Let me show you one other place in the Scriptures where something like this takes place, just to show you that I'm not making this kind of thing up. Ezekiel 34, turn there if you would. A very different kind of reference, but I want you to notice what's going on here. Ezekiel, writing during the time of the exile and looking forward to the work of Christ Jesus, he says this, or rather the Lord says through him. Ezekiel 34, beginning in verse 23. "And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken." Now, here, I think, is clearly a reference in which Ezekiel is speaking of what the Lord will do in and through Jesus Christ as the shepherd of his people. But notice how he refers to him by using the name David, who is long dead. He's drawing from the past historical realities to speak of the future work of God that is yet to come. The same kind of thing is taking place in Daniel chapter 11. And he's speaking of what is going to happen past the days of Antiochus IV. On the last day, as the Lord brings evil to its final demise, but draws from the historical idiom of what God's people are suffering through in the days, or would suffer through in the days of Antiochus IV. And the purpose is this, that they are to know, perhaps even in their dying breath, that when God deals with evil on the last day, He will deal with every evil of our day. When He deals with evil on the last day, it's not merely Him dealing with the evil that will come in generations to follow, but God is going to bring low and cause to fall all of the evil that His people have suffered even in our day. And that's what they're to see. That the final downfall of what God will do, causing such hostility against Him and His people to fall and not to last, will surely be secured when even evil is brought to nothing on the last day. Listen to how it's described again in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Verse 8, when the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of His mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of His coming. Notice when Christ appears, there's not much of a conflict, is there? By the breath of His mouth. The slightest exertion of the fact that He is alive brings the lawless one to nothing. A mere breath, a mere appearance, and he is brought to nothing with none to help him. Two brief applications for us in closing. The first is this, in terms of the suffering of God's people. Whatever it is that the people of God endure in this world, remember what we've seen in this text. God is always being faithful to and fulfilling His covenant purposes. It can't be any other way. The worst that can happen is that the people of God are sanctified. But what actually does happen is that many are added to the number of the people of God. We saw it in the text. Even in the midst of hostility and persecution, the church grows, the church is purified, and God is faithful. The second thing for us to remember has to do with this, and the question of when will God deal with the evil of our own day? Some people wonder whether or not we're in the final days that immediately precede the coming of Christ Jesus. Well, let me tell you, I don't know. And if someone tells you that they do know that we are, please don't listen to them. When it comes, we will know. But we do know this, that when God finally and ultimately brings evil to nothing, He will deal with every display of evil that we have found in our day. All of it. God will deal with all. And He will do it in such a way that He shows His faithfulness and His kindness to His people.